When you really start working with people and talking to people, you see that one diet works really well for a certain group of people. And then you can have another group of people that can do the same exact diet and it works terribly for them. You can take the attitude of, well, they just did it wrong, or you can go a little bit deeper. There are also things like supplements and things like hormone replacement therapy, which same people can have a great response to them or an absolutely terrible response. So today's guest, Kashif Khan and I are going to talk about this. We're going to talk about diet, hormone replacement therapy, which is a controversial topic, exercise, and why certain people have a really good response to these things, and certain people have the opposite response and might even develop certain cancers and more metabolic issues from doing the same thing that is beneficial to someone else. Now, Kashif and I are actually going to be holding a webinar at the end of January that's going to be available to the community. And that link will be down in the show notes because I was so excited after having this conversation. I wanted to know how could I really deliver more of Kashif's information to the rest of my community. So if this conversation is interesting to you, make sure you head down to the link in the show notes to sign up for that webinar so that you can learn more about yourself and how you might be responding to the things that are going on in your environment and how you could actually make an upgrade to your routines, nutrition, and all of the above. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you so much for watching. A lot of people are quick to talk about the benefits of sunlight, but what gets often missed in the conversation is the benefit of darkness and the importance of protecting yourself from blue and green light after sunset. That is why I choose Viva Rays as my go-to source for protecting my circadian rhythms. You can use the code YOGI to save 15% off at Viva Rays. Now, you may have seen some of these studies popping up. I call them fear mongering about blue blockers not being effective. And that is a partial truth because when you use blue blockers that are clear or that have not been tested with a spectrometer to actually block what they say they do, they will not protect your circadian rhythms and they are not catching those key wavelengths that you need to be blocking in order for your body to be able to repair, for you to make melatonin, which is a master antioxidant. And artificial light at night has been in the scientific literature extensively linked to a host of hormonal cancers, obesity, diabetes, and all sorts of metabolic issues. That again is why I choose Viva Rays as my go-to source for protecting my circadian rhythms to allow my body to get adequate darkness at night. You can use the code YOGI to save 15% over at Viva Rays, and you can actually trust that they block the frequencies of light that they say they do. Thanks to Viva Rays for sponsoring today's podcast. If you've been listening to the show for the last few years, you know I'm a huge fan of red light therapy. There are over 10,000 studies now in publication showing the health benefits of red light therapy. And there is a lot of research showing how red light therapy can help to improve skin health. I have been on the fence about trying one of the red light therapy face masks, and I've definitely been waiting to find one that uses the specific frequencies that actually show improvement with skin health. 630 nanometers for red and 850 nanometers for near infrared. And Bond Charge checks off all of those boxes. So I've been trying this mask out for the last month and I absolutely love it. It's super lightweight. It does not make your face sweat and it's very simple to use. All you need is 10 minutes. You can actually use my code Sarah Kleiner, all one word, to save 15% off at Bond Charge. You can use it on any of their products, but I really, really like their red light therapy face mask. And I think it's something that's worth a try if you're looking to naturally improve your skin health. So check it out. Again, use code Sarah Kleiner, all one word, to save 15% over at Bond Charge. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I have a really special guest, Kashif Khan, and we're going to talk about some things I haven't necessarily talked about on the show as much. And that is really just the bioindividuality of people, how they respond to everything from diet soda to HRT and everything in between. So, Kashif, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Great to be here with you.
Yeah. And, I was just listening to you on Tom Bilyeu's show and talking a little bit about your origin story. Maybe we could start there and then kind of see where things go.
Yeah, given that I built like a health and wellness research company, my story doesn't make sense. Well, and I guess in some ways it does, which is that I was sick. So I don't actually
Yeah.
come from the industry. I had no formal training, not a scientist, not a clinician. I actually ran a technology company where we help tech startups grow. So everything from legal to marketing to accounting, just helping them do all of what they didn't know they needed to do. And around the age of 38, I got really sick. I'm
Mhm.
45 now. It's been some time, but eczema all over my face. I couldn't open my left eye for weeks. Psoriasis, I had gut issues, depression, didn't want to get out of bed. And that was unpredictable. Some days were good, some days weren't. And the thing that drove me to the doctor was migraines. It was uncontrollable, debilitating, intense migraines. And so my simple question to the doctors, five different doctors, different pills was, what did I do? I must have eaten something, breathed something. I must have done because there's no serendipity in these five things hitting me all at the same time, and I've never been sick before. What did I do? Like, no, you have these things. And that was the first time I realized that it's not the doctor's job to actually answer that question. I didn't know. I literally never needed a doctor before. And so I then went on a journey of self-discovery, traditional Chinese medicine, naturopathy, homeopathy, learning about environmental toxins, environmental medicine, understanding hormones, and diving deeper and deeper in all these rabbit holes until finally I hit my own DNA and learned about all these broken lines of code and why when me and my business partner were in the same office, eating the same food, living in the same neighborhood, waking up at the same time, same number of children, literally doppelganger lives. And I was sick and he wasn't, so I actually truly believed the doctors at that point. And then I learned that no, I was wired different. So all those same choices hit me different. I walked away from my business, gave it to my business partner, and said that I found my purpose. I'm going to invest in this, and I ended up building the research out of it.
I love it. Yeah, and I think that's just a really important point because as a someone who's been in health coaching for a decade plus, I can give a protocol or a diet to one person and they're like, "Wow, this is the best thing I've ever done for myself," and it's more so with diets that I see this and fasting
Yeah,
protocols and they just take it and run with it. And then another person tries it and they're like, "I can't sleep. I'm anxious. I
yeah,
feel terrible." And I had to learn that because I was, big into the carnivore world. And carnivore did amazing things for me until it stopped, until my hormones completely crashed and I was having
yeah.
fertility issues. And so that process has really made me pause and say, why do some people do so well with certain diets? Why do certain people get sick, have mold toxicity, and live in the same house as other people who don't get it? And really digging into that story more. And yeah, that's why I'm excited to talk about this with
That's
you.
a perfect example of you're going to eat multiple times a day, every day. Let's at least get that right, you know?
Yes.
And even that, we are so individual and unique in the way we metabolize, the way we make enzymes. And so over and over again, we do see people that will go on a carnivore diet. And anybody, whether you go carnivore, keto, vegan, you do something clean and you feel great in the first few days, a few weeks. You get into ketosis, your brain is firing amazing, you're burning fat as fuel. It takes a few weeks, 5 to 8 weeks before you start to feel off. And it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to blame the diet because it didn't feel bad in the beginning. So you start actually addressing the fatigue and the brain fog and the hormone issues as separate issues, as opposed to my diet is causing all of this. So even that, carnivore, how effectively can you actually turn fat into fuel? There's a
Mm-hmm.
pathway called ApoA2 in the body that determines that. So it's very easy to predict. Some people genetically will have a horrible insulin response from fat in as much as other people do from sugar, right?
Yes.
And so that's genetically predeterminable. So
Mm-hmm.
even knowing that one thing and getting that right, but this is where functional genetics, the kind of science and interpretation that we built from our research versus genetics actually makes it easy to apply this stuff. If you ask a geneticist or scientist, is there a carnivore gene? They would say, no, that's nonsense. But if you
Mm-hmm.
ask me, I would say we can interpret what your genes are doing for the question you're asking. And it's a much more useful way to approach, which is what should my habits be?
Hmm.
What's my unique personal playbook and what should my habits be? And my genome can predict how I'm going to receive different habits and therefore what do I remove and what do I add? And that's a better way to look at it.
Yep. And I just want to back up a little bit here because kind of the way that I look at all health is at the health of the mitochondria.
Yeah.
How well does the mitochondria make water and ATP, these energy currencies that we run on. I kind of have a different school of thinking of like the water is so incredibly crucial in the body. And that's why trauma and nervous system and all these other things play such a huge role because of this imprint of water in the body being 99% water molecule. But coming from that and saying that, and everything kind of stems off of how well are your mitochondrial functioning and looking at Dr. Doug Wallace's work and him saying that essentially we don't start to see genetic issues until mitochondria become 70% or more dysfunctional. You know, a lot of people have very dysfunctional mitochondria. And so I kind of have for years just been like, I'm not going to stress about the whole genetic thing, but our world is so toxic, unfortunately. I don't want to fear
Yeah.
monger or make anyone stress, but our air, our food, our, like I said, nervous system and trauma, those things alone can impact mitochondria up to, I think it's 30% according to the work of Martin Picard. And people are being bombarded with these things. And so, I for the longest time was like, oh, genetics, whatever. And now that I'm at 45 and I'm still a decade plus in health coaching and just seeing things, I'm kind of like, well, maybe this is a relevant conversation that we do need to look at a little bit. Am I completely off base with my thinking, or
So
would you have
I
something you would
agree with
add to
that. And what
that?
Dr. Walls is saying in terms of what was known about genetics was
Mm-hmm.
that genes cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
And there's 22,000 genes in your body. I only look at about, I think 95 or 96 of them, just under 100, because those are the ones that actually drive the functional pathways that you can action. Yes, for some rare disease, okay, you may have genetic wiring for sickle cell syndrome. Why
Mm-hmm.
weren't you born with it? Why did it trickle in later? Because of your body being resilient with full mitochondrial capacity at a certain age. And as you age, those mitochondria shrink, deplete, they die off in number and
Right.
they're affected by environmental toxins, etc., and you have less capacity. And all of a sudden, that thing that was lingering in the background starts to win, and it manifests itself. The functional pathways, how you make hormones, how you metabolize them, how you make neurochemicals, how you metabolize foods, how you detoxify chemicals, how you fight inflammation. These are all innate, and they are from the time you're born to the time you die, don't change
Mm-hmm.
and they don't get studied because they don't lead to medication. Remember, the research, billions of dollars put into genetic research was all for this hope for these magic pills, right? Turn a gene on,
Yep.
turn a gene off, which is
Mm-hmm.
what we're saying doesn't manifest until you get poor mitochondrial energy. But the everyday challenges we deal with, according to the CDC, 90% of the $4.3 trillion healthcare budget is spent on chronic disease. None of that is caused by a gene. It's caused by a hormone profile or a metabolic profile plus your habits, right? And so a simple example, somebody may have an incredible ability to make estrogens, right? Woman may be estrogen dominant, but she also may be converting those estrogens into metabolites that are inflammatory.
Mm-hmm.
And that, whether you have good mitochondria or not, if you decide to disrupt your hormones with birth control pill, with cosmetic soap shampoos, you're going to overload that system and cause things like breast cancer, ovarian cancer, etc. Or
Mm-hmm.
you have a very clean endocrine disrupting life, meaning you don't disrupt your hormones and nothing ever manifests. Doesn't matter where you're at
Right.
energy-wise. So just thinking about the majority of problems, and this is the beauty of this, is the majority of what we're struggling with is much easier to manage and control. The stuff that we don't have in our control are the small, it's literally 3% of healthcare, which are the rare genetic conditions, which most of us are worried about that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, I love that because I don't want people to get so super hung up on the genes thing. I think it's relevant. Obviously, that's why I brought you here because I think it's a conversation, especially my ladies who are, like myself in their 40s, 50s, and beyond, and they're thinking about hormone replacement, healthy aging, these sorts of things. I think it is a relevant conversation. But I don't want people thinking like this is like a death sentence because of what you just said. You can do a ton to clean up your lifestyle and your diet
Yeah.
and your environment, healthy air, help, good clean water, and impact your health and never have to deal with some of these issues that you might have genes for. But I want people to also be aware that, some women, there's this whole HRT thing now going on. And that's
Yeah.
another reason I want to talk with you is because I have women in my community who are hearing this HRT conversation and they feel fine and they're not on any hormones just yet. But there's this whole conversation of like, hey, if you don't use hormones, you are going to get dementia. You're going to have weight gain. You're going to have insulin resistance because of this dropping estrogen. But they're like, I feel okay, but I'm feeling all this pressure for hormones. And then there's the other impact of like, do you have specific genes that could lead to ovarian cancer, breast cancer, if
Hmm.
you bring estrogen into the picture? Because the conversation has swung so far the other way that
Yeah.
it's being dismissed now as a possible risk for doing HRT that breast cancer or ovarian cancer could develop. And so I really want to dig into this one a little bit more.
Yeah. So this will really open people's eyes to how to think about genetics effectively. So breast cancer, I'm sure a lot of the listeners here have heard of the BRCA gene, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
BRCA is this four-letter word that's very scary to women. And there was something called the Angelina Jolie effect where she was told by a doctor, you have the BRCA gene, now go cut your breasts off,
Right.
right? And that was the answer. Like the best they could come
Right.
up with is cut two of your body parts off.
And I
And
know
and
women who've
really,
done that personally. Like to this day,
yeah,
I know women doing that. A good friend of mine
yeah.
just did. Yeah.
And the sad thing is, if I tell you the truth, it's like, why did they do that? Right? And
Mm-hmm.
why are the clinicians taught this? And they're taught this because the functional answer would demolish the cancer industry, which is I think it's like a $400 billion industry, right? So nobody wants that going away. Well, certain people don't want it going away. Um,
Right.
so what's actually going on? There's a gene called CYP19A1, and this shows you how we can think about genes in in relationship to the actual biology of the body. So not the gene is a prescription for a problem. The gene just points to priority. Here's something you need to focus on, and now go change your habits, right?
Mm.
So, and I'll use the hormone therapy as an example. I worked on a breast cancer group. There's a lady in California named Dr. Jen Simmons, who's an oncologist that works very integrative and functional when it comes to breast cancer. So the first place she goes is diet, and then detox, etc., before even looking at medication, even though she's an MD. So she really helps women with that. So I did a
Mm.
master class with her where we had a whole bunch of women that had their second, third, fourth bout of cancer, trying to figure
Wow.
out why. Like, why does it keep coming back? What am I doing wrong? And so we use genetics to figure that out. And I would say about 25% of the women I had to tell them it was because of their hormone therapy. And I'm not saying
Wow.
hormone therapy is good or bad, but I'm saying that for certain women, you have to be very specific in the word you use, bioindividual, in terms of what are you putting in your body. Because
Mm-hmm.
the assumption is I put this in my body, that's what's now in my body.
Right.
Versus I put this in my body and there's genes that see it that are instructing to turn it into something else,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that something else is not what the doctor understood is the net result. So let me give you an example. There's a gene called CYP19A1 that's responsible for how efficiently you aromatize or convert your testosterone into estrogen. Some
Mm-hmm.
women have a really good version of the gene, which doesn't necessarily mean good news. It means they're doing it too much when now they are estrogen dominant. They're making too much estrogen, right? Step two of three, after they make that estrogen, there's three potential buckets you can fill. 2-hydroxyestrogen, 4-hydroxyestrogen, 16-hydroxy. And when we talk about preventing Alzheimer's, good for your brain, good for your heart, that we were told to take hormones for, that's the 2-hydroxy, the beneficial and protective version. 4 and 16 cause inflammation. So you may be estrogen dominant and estrogen toxic because there's genes that just instruct where it goes. Think of it as like plumbing, it's flowing through these pipes, right? Last
Mm-hmm.
step, there's detoxification, sorry, pathways in your body that already exist, that are genetically driven, and it's possible to have broken code or even missing genes, like the pathway doesn't even exist.
Mm-hmm.
So estrogen dominant, estrogen toxic, bad detoxification. Still, that woman doesn't get sick. Now add that she takes the birth control pill for 10, 15 years. overloading that story with too much estrogen, or she goes on hormone replacement therapy and unknowingly takes what's called estradiol, which the
Mm-hmm.
CYP1B1 gene directly converts into the 4-hydroxyestrogen, which causes an inflammatory metabolite that causes breast cancer and ovarian cancer. So by
Mm.
adding a hormone to your body to protect yourself without first knowing what your body is going to turn it into, and by the way, some women aren't doing this. And this is why you have that conflict of like it causes cancer, it doesn't cause cancer. It
Mm-hmm.
makes you feel great,
Right.
makes you feel sick because we're not the same. So for sure,
Right.
some women it's going to feel incredible. And in some women
Yep.
it's going to be I'm bloated, I have pain, I can't sleep, it's going to make them feel horrible. So if you have a fast CYP1B, 1A1 pathway and you're making the good stuff, it's not a problem. If you're not estrogen dominant, it's not a problem. If you are the profile I just described, it is likely going to cause within 2 to 3 years some major problem. And
Mm.
so now the options are, do I tweak my hormone profile now that I know my genetic code and I get it right and don't cause a problem? Or do I potentially add something to detoxify and support the removal of the toxic estrogens? And so you have options. But going in blind, throwing a dart and just hoping it works, right?
Right.
Versus the science is now there and we can figure this out for anybody.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I want to talk more on this topic, but I know I'm going to get asked this question. How do women know? How can people find out if they have these specific genes? Is it a matter of expensive testing? Could they go to, like, if they were dumb like me and did a 23andMe 15, 20 years ago, can you pull out that? Like, we didn't know our data was going to be sold. We're just like, oh, cool, let's do a genetic test. Um,
Yeah,
so many people have that. And I had Dr. Anthony J. I don't know if you know him. He wrote Estrogeneration. Uh,
right.
he pulled my raw data off of 23andMe back when I was trying to get pregnant in 2021 and read all that to me. And I don't know if we even talked about that, but I don't know if that's a possibility if you can find some of these genes. Do you have a
So,
way to tell people to
yeah,
find
to
this?
your point, those tests are designed to sell data. So here's the
Mm-hmm.
nasty,
Yeah.
secret of the DNA industry. Because your DNA doesn't change, it's the only thing that once you test it, the results are never changing. It's permanent.
Right.
So all
Right.
the genetic testing companies didn't really have a good business model because what do? You test it once and you're done. So they
Right.
all became data selling businesses. And now
Mm-hmm.
the challenge with that is the real customer isn't the person paying two, $300 to buy a test. It's the person paying $20,000 to research the data. And so who is the test designed for? The data they're collecting, who is being served? It's not you. And that's why so many people are underwhelmed by the reports and the results. Versus if I have to solve the problems I'm talking about, what I'm looking for, the pharma companies don't care about. They're not trying to, they don't study healthy people to ask them, why are you so healthy? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to make a conscious choice and decide to test the functional pathways that are actually actionable. And even if I tried to sell the data, pharma companies don't want it, right? But yes, the majority of genetic testing out there is a pull your data and sell it business model, or license it or lease it or something at that level. So in terms of how do you do it, in terms of how I do it, there's two ways. Somebody can buy a test and read and learn. I think it's like a $500 test, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the majority of people I work with go through master classes where we do major deep dives.
Okay.
I can't work with everybody. So instead, I host groups so that I can help everybody learn. And
Mm-hmm.
that way we can go much deeper and I can personalize the experience by talking to people all day long. So those are two options. There is testing, and I can give you links for this stuff with the discounts for everybody. And
Cool.
then, but that's how. And I would say that testing isn't the answer, it's interpretation.
Right.
And
That's
that's what
100%.
the industry, yeah, that's what the industry got wrong, is the industry tests were designed by PhDs for PhDs. They weren't
Mm-hmm.
designed for you and me to figure out and solve our problems. And I figured that out because I needed to make the report better for me. So I
Mm-hmm.
redesigned how things are done in the way I wished they looked when I first got sick, right? Which a
Mm-hmm.
layperson should be able to read it and say, oh, I get it now. And so, yeah, so
Yeah.
interpretation is key. And this is why the research model that I built was 3 years, we actually managed the health of 7,000 people, one by
Wow.
one by one by one, to learn everything we needed to know to be able to interpret what do these genes actually mean and how do I action it. So, yeah, interpretation is key.
Awesome. Yeah, and everybody that's watching, make sure we'll put some links down in the show notes, but we might try to figure out a way to do a masterclass just for
Yeah.
the evolving wellness podcast community. And so stay tuned for that because that's something I think would be really cool and value add for my community. But just going back to the hormone replacement, I had a client recently who her girlfriend was like raving about testosterone. Oh, I tried testosterone and they're, mid 40s. I feel so great. I feel so amazing. And my client had very low testosterone on her blood test, but she actually felt okay. She wasn't having a lot of the symptoms of low testosterone. So she went and
Mm.
she tried the testosterone gel, got an actual bioidentical testosterone gel, was doing a very small dose of it, and immediately had issues sleeping, felt very angry, like just she kept trying to push through it. I was like, I don't think this is working. But
Yeah.
she wanted to just like keep pushing through it. And eventually, after 2 months, her testosterone was only up to like a 30 nanograms per milliliter, I think, after testing, which is still kind of like low. And she was not sleeping. She was rage. She was angry, all this stuff. And so she pulled herself off of it. And for 2 months straight, she had tinnitus and she
Mm.
had insomnia and she had like just these horrible headaches, just every day, just massive headaches. And now I think the symptoms have just kind of like evened out.
Yeah.
But that was one of the things I'm like watching her kind of go through this. I'm like, I think what happened is that testosterone was blocking your estrogen production. It was being converted into cortisol, and it just wasn't right for you. Now I don't know the genetic
Mm.
thing that could be behind this, but yeah, that situation was like, all right, I need to do a little bit more of a deep dive to HRT because I've got
Yeah.
more and more in my community that are trying it. And after watching that, I'm like, that's horrible. Like she's still having a little tinnitus, the headaches are gone, and it's been 2 months. And I'm like, eek.
Yep. So there's a couple things going on there. And just having seen this so many times, and this is why we spent the 3 years with the 7,000 people, so we could learn to interpret. And
Mm,
what you're describing there, I'm pretty certain I know what's going on. And what there's a few layers. It's never one lever to pull. If it's
right.
ever one thing, it's not, we are resilient. We're designed to thrive. Our bodies
Yes.
know how to repair itself. It takes a lot before it pushes you into symptoms. So there's usually multiple things going wrong. So in
Mm-hmm.
this case, so it reminds me of work we did with the NHL. So I live in Toronto, so it's like a mecca for NHL hockey training. So in the off season, all the hockey players come here from everywhere and they all get trained. And we work with a lot of the trainers on the genetics and getting them optimized for these players. And so in 2019, there was this phenomenon where all of a sudden, all these hockey players were coming to us saying they can't recover.
Mm.
Their body was falling apart and they had libido issues. And we're like wondering what's going on. And we realized that it became a trend to have an androgel, just like you said, a testosterone gel, right? So they put this
Mm.
androgel pack on their stomach, the testosterone gets absorbed, and you would think the net result is you just increase that person's testosterone.
Right.
So some of these men had a fast version of that same CYP19A1 gene I was saying, where they were converting it all into estrogen, and they
Mm.
started to feel bad. Then the answer was maybe you need more. And then they started to get gynecomastia, man boobs, like literally man
Oh,
boobs. So they
yeah.
were changing their physical structure because they were overloaded in estrogens. And what I showed them was you didn't have a lack of testosterone. You had a highly aggressive conversion into estrogen. So we just need to slow that down. You actually don't need to add anything. It's more about better utilizing what you already make. And so
Mm.
we added some DIM, which is a very common supplement, slowed the CYP19A1 gene down. A couple other things, EGCG, green tea extract, resveratrol. These are things that are known to slow that gene down. And all of a sudden, they had better access to their free-flowing testosterone and didn't need to add anything. Then we hear
Ah,
that's part of the story. Now we hear something like that client you're working with, where there's an androgen receptor. So there's a gene that determines how effective your androgen receptor is. And this is where looking at blood work, here's a level. Are you
mm-hmm.
told why? You're just told the
Right.
level, right? But you
Right.
don't know why. How did you get there, right? We should
Right.
all be at good levels for everything because we're all the same human beings, right? So if you have a really efficient androgen receptor, the best version of the gene, your blood work is going to show low testosterone. because you're so good at using it,
Okay.
right? And so the
Very
androX,
true.
or also known as the AR gene, some women just do a better job. And
Mm,
that means two things. They're already well along their way of being androgenized. They don't need more, but they also potentially may not be making enough estrogen because testosterone is the fuel for estrogen. So it's a different problem to solve. It's not you adding more, it's slowing that pathway down, right?
okay.
There's also dihydrotestosterone, DHT. And some people take their testosterone and convert it into dihydrotestosterone, which is the manly man version. It's 16 times more potent than regular testosterone, but it's also inflammatory and will make you angry and will make you lose your hair and will cause acne, will cause ovarian cysts,
She was
right?
having like teeth sensitivity,
Yeah.
the teeth and tinnitus, all this stuff. I'm like, oh, get off, stop.
Yeah. So this stuff will cause inflammation. It's
Mm,
designed for a warrior. This DHT, dihydrotestosterone, is designed for you to be working your muscle till failure every day. That's what it's for, right? Super
mhm.
athlete. And if you're not doing that, you just gave
Not a
yourself wiring that you're
45-year-old woman.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's
Yeah.
likely what was going on with her is great receptors, which is why her blood work showed up funky. And then she's turning it into DHT, which would feel horrible, right? And
Mhm,
then
mhm,
there's two more steps, which is there's detox pathways that get your DHT out of your body. So
mhm.
she may be lacking there, and then it lingered for far too long. Then there's methylation pathways, anti-inflammatory pathways. Why did she get tinnitus? When
Yeah.
you don't deal with methylation properly, the one of the first places will hit you is in your nervous system. And tinnitus and numbness of the fingers, those are usually the first two things that happen, right? And
Okay.
so it's she probably also wasn't methylating properly. So it's like a perfect
Yeah.
storm
Yeah.
of all these bits and pieces. And if you know them all, that's why I'm saying there's never one lever to pull. You support them
Yeah.
all, and all of a sudden you feel incredible and you do it the right way.
Okay. And I know a lot of women start to struggle with tinnitus during perimenopause and menopause. I mean, there's so many women out there that are like perimenopause awareness, and it's almost to the
Yeah.
point where it's making women scared, which I really don't like.
Yeah.
Um, but I do feel like we need to have some awareness about women as they go through these hormonal shifts. These are some things that could happen, and how can we best support these women? That's what I'm all about. I don't want to scaring anybody of like, here's all these crazy symptoms. But then on the other end of it, I do get the women, some of them get these like severe depression, anxiety episodes. Some get tinnitus. Some just have these horrible things to happen. And I support them holistically through circadian rhythms, through diet, through very natural things, red light therapy. And that helps a lot. If we can get metabolic pathways working, if we can get them leptin sensitive, insulin sensitive, that helps tremendously. But then some
Yeah.
women still, they come across these things, and I'm like, I want to know, like, I got to figure this out. This is where I'm always at. Like when I have a client with issues like that, she's just miserable. I'm like, I got to figure this out.
Yeah. And to your point, it doesn't matter who I'm working with, what problem they're trying to fix. The first place we always start is mood and behavior,
Mm,
executive function, how they think. And even though most people say, well, that's not what I came for, I'll say, let me help you solve the problem in the way that I think I can, right? Which is
mhm.
in today's world, it's so easy to be stuck in fight or flight. It's so easy
Yes.
to be stuck in a high cortisol addiction. It's so easy to be stuck in anxiety is my normal, right? And you just feel culturally, we're told deal with it. You're weak if you don't. Now, if you are in a fight or flight, rest and recovery is shut off. So all the great work you're doing to fix your body, the ROI becomes slim to none because your body instead thinks it's time for battle. And if your hormone profile genetically is more androgenized, that means blood pumping to your fists and your feet to go fight and no nutrients going to your organs, no detox to the organs, you're going to get sick. If you're more estrogenized, it's going to be turning into the warrior that was designed to protect the tribe and heightened awareness, looking for problems and storing fat on your body because of potential famine. So the body will literally change, thinking that you're still a cave person and this is battle time, right? So
Mhm.
going deep into the neurochemicals of the brain, neurochemicals don't lie. What you bind, how long they last will determine how you perceive things and how you feel. And the genes that drive them also don't lie. And to give you an example, I did some work with the Navy SEALs. It was a research project. There's a guy named Dr. Andy Walsh. He's an Australian doctor that was hired by the US military to kind of do like future of health type stuff, right? He's one of
Mhm.
the old school biohackers before anyone knew what the word biohacker, what the word meant, right? And so he hired
Mhm.
us to come do this research with him. And the question was, why, when these guys go out, same training, same food, same exposure, some of them get PTSD and some of them don't? I said, well,
Mm.
the answer's in your question. It's they're not the same people. And if they have the same, of course you're going to have a different result. So I showed them
Mhm.
a couple of things. One thing is there's a gene called ADRA2B that regulates your adrenaline response. So when there's that moment of impactful stimulus, bomb going off, pulling a trigger, there's that adrenaline rush. And for some people, so the purpose of the adrenaline is two things: to change your biology to give you everything you need in that moment to thrive.
Mm.
Second is to create an imprint so that you remember that impactful stimulus and avoid that level of threat again. That's what your
Mhm.
body does. It remembers the pain, effectively creates trauma. And for most of us, it creates an intellectual trauma where the gene expression stays on, and we know to avoid. Some people that have bad genes here also imprint an emotional trauma. They
Mm.
remember what it felt like, not only information it gave them. And the next time something reminds them of it, that gene causes them to experience it as if it's happening again. It's a continuation. There was no gap in the middle. It's like, I can't deal with this. It's causing me pain. But even then, not all soldiers wired that way had an issue. There's a second gene called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which determines how effectively you make brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is the key fertilizer for your brain to make new neurons. So every time you believe a new thing, learn a new skill, you have new neurology in your brain to process it, and this is the ingredient your brain uses to make that. So if you have bad BDNF genetics, there's a bit of a lag time in your body's
Mm.
ability to make new brain hardware. And so that same big deal, bomb goes off. One person's already figuring out how to protect everyone, which direction to go, how to deal with it, and the other person experiences a shell shock, frozen,
Mm.
overwhelmed, because they have bad BDNF genes and they can't process fast enough, which means that that moment had a lot more meaning to them, a lot of
Mm.
weight. Now combine that, I bind trauma emotionally, and the thing I experience has a lot of weight and meaning. That person should never be deployed in active combat.
Mm.
Right? That person trying to deal in their healthcare journey, where every time they see an email from the doctor, doesn't even want to open it, they're procrastinating, right? That
Mhm.
person who every time they hear a podcast, like, oh, that's me. Oh, here we go again. I'm in pain again, right? So
Mm.
versus unwinding, releasing, and breaking the trauma, and that's actually what's preventing you from getting better. It's a mood and behavior thing, and it doesn't mean good or bad. There's no such thing as good or bad when it comes to neurochemicals. It's more context. Who are you?
Mhm.
What are you wired for? And are you doing that? Or are you doing something else which makes you feel bad? So yeah, we
Yeah.
always start there because it's like that's one of the biggest blocks today is fight or flight, trauma, anxiety, stress.
Yeah, and people are in it big time right now. I mean, especially the last month, it's just having an online business for
Yeah.
me. It's been very nerve-wracking just trying to go on and work. And then I'm like, oh, why am I looking at this? Like you just,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
almost can't look away from the extreme polarity, the anger, all the things that are going on. You know, here we are, November 15th, the day we're recording this. So a lot of things bubbling right
Yeah.
now that are really getting people even more into this fight flight on all sides of it. And so
Yeah.
I feel like that's the root of a lot of issues. And I look at it from the layer of the water in the body and how that instructs the cells as well, like looking at Emoto's work and Veda Austin's work. And it's like you can see what happens to water when you talk to it a certain way or expose it to different sound or frequency. And it's like this is what is your body is made of 99% by a water molecule. So you're going to keep putting yourself in these horrible situations and thinking these things. And it's like, what do you think's going to happen? How do you
Yeah.
think your body's going to interpret that instruction? So yeah, it's very, very layered. So I love that you start with that. And how do you really, with people with this nervous system dysregulation, if I'm understanding it correctly, how do you work with people in that scope or instruct them?
Even that bioindividual, the
Mhm.
problem to solve. So the way we feel may feel, talk to 10 different people and they'll all describe the same feeling, but what got them there genetically may be different for all 10 of them. And
Mhm.
so the step one is what's actually going on with your neurochemical map. And the solution isn't the same for everybody. And that, again, coming back to by individual, if we actually solve the right problem, it works really well. And if
Mm-hmm.
you, and this is why can be in talk therapy for a decade or more, because they're trying to talk through a physiological problem. It's not
Mm-hmm.
a I need to just chat with somebody problem. It's your body is actually holding on to a physical trauma and it needs to be released. So it comes back to down to starting with first understanding the wiring. Some people are warriors that don't even feel the stress. And the fight or flight for them is because they burn themselves out because they're able to take so much on. Some people are
Mm-hmm.
the opposite, which they're not capable of handling any at all. And so they fry their nervous system. Some people, like I said, bind the trauma. Some people have a heightened awareness of detail. And so
Mm-hmm.
their ability to actually filter and prioritize is dysregulated. And so they see the world at a higher level of detail. And that might be the single problem with their neurochemicals where, every little thing they hear and see, they're reading between the lines over. And you know who these people are when an email
Oh,
comes
I
to them.
do, because they're in my group and they're listening to like 30 podcasts a day.
Yes,
I'm
yes,
like, please, number one, stop, unsubscribe.
yeah,
Like, and I know this
yeah,
is a podcast people are listening to, but if I, I want people listening to this, but if I'm overwhelming you with my information, please don't listen to it. Like, take a break, stop
yeah,
listening to 30 health podcasts a day and get diagnosing yourself with things and taking quizzes online. And
yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
it's a big problem.
It is a big challenge. And I could tell you that whenever I'm dealing with a mature woman, say 40 plus,
Mm-hmm.
who has a story of first this happened, then that happened, then I fixed this, but then that happened, and I don't get why I do all this stuff and this isn't working. It's usually one of two things. It's either their serotonin dysregulation, they can't prioritize stimulus and they're overthinking, or it's hormones and they're making a toxic estrogen that's causing inflammation that isn't being addressed. Those are the two big ones, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
but the biggest one is that, like, almost guaranteed with certainty, there's going to be a mood and behavior issue for a woman who's truly stuck and things keep manifesting. And by dealing
Mm-hmm.
with that first, often by the time you unravel and solve the mood issue, the actual symptoms don't need to be worked on because they resolve themselves. Your
Yeah.
brain doesn't know what's happening. Your brain is relying on your thoughts. And
Yes.
if your thoughts convince your brain there's a problem, your brain's like, okay, biology, let me go drive things that equal what you believe to be true.
Right. Right.
And you'll actually manifest things, or you can take a 2 out of 10 and turn it into an 8 or 9 out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's why we always go through this first.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think that's where a lot of people are, especially the ladies in my group. I love them, and they're every day answering questions and kind of just checking in on them. And I feel a lot of them, they're in that spot of just like bringing in too much, and they're in that stage of life where they have kids and elderly parents at the same time, and they're just their plate is super full, and then they're trying to fix themselves, and it's just like just the wires are getting crossed. And I'm like, we
Yeah.
need to back up a little bit when it comes to all this health stuff, and look at the nervous system and look at how, what you can control in the situation.
Yep. Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And just kind of going back to diet, because that's a big one. I did a carnivore diet, and that's how I got this, platform essentially, was talking about my experience with the carnivore diet. And then fast forward to 2021, trying to get pregnant, deciding to have that second baby, and couldn't get pregnant on carnivore. Was having thyroid problems and hormone problems on carnivore. And so I shifted into circadian biology and light and looking at things more through the lens of the mitochondria. And that's how I got pregnant in my 40s and had a healthy baby. And so that shifted this podcast and this whole entire community to that lens. And so, you know, I do still get quite a few questions about diet and what should I eat. And, I have a different perspective now on diet of like, it's not a one size fits all. In my leptin program, I have 4 hours of material because I'm always like asking the question, if this is you, then let's try this. If this happens, then let's try this. Like I have several different scenarios in there instead of a one size fits all, because I do see some people doing great on one diet and some people not doing so great on one diet. And, you know, maybe we could dive a little deeper into that. I know we covered it a little bit in the beginning of people doing okay on keto 5 to 6 weeks and then all of a sudden feeling terrible. But what are the genetic, from your lens, what should people look out for and be aware of in this whole diet conversation?
So it should feel good, right? You're not supposed to
Mm-hmm.
feel bad. You're not supposed to be bloated, gassy, constipated, diarrhea, And so what's going on is there's certain enzymes the body makes for various types of foods. And I would say the big aha moment for some people, the most shocking one is the people that have been vegan for some time that aren't wired for it. Because it
That
is
are
also,
wired or they're not wired for it.
they're not wired for it. Yeah.
Mm.
And
Yeah, I
I'm
did
not
it for
saying it's
2 years
everybody, but
and
this
then
is,
I crashed.
yeah. Yeah. So there's very specific enzymes that your body makes that genes instruct for how you effectively break down your plant proteins, lentils, beans, legumes, also your kale, your spinach, your cruciferous vegetables, right? And if you don't make those enzymes, which is genetically predictable, you might feel good in the beginning because you went clean, let's say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
You're going to cause major, major hormone issues, mood issues, energy issues, muscle retention issues, and then eventually insulin issues. And it all
mm-hmm,
came back from you eating something that you can't actually process.
mm-hmm,
And so then there becomes options, which is I need to cut certain things out, or I need to treat the food different. Like even something as simple as making sure to sprout your vegan proteins because that allows
mm-hmm,
the nutrient to be more bioavailable, adding some digestive enzymes. So I would say that's a big area where people are struggling in their health and didn't know it had anything to do with their diet, and they're just not wired to be plant-based.
right.
I can
Yeah.
also tell you, sorry.
I was going to say, that was what tipped me over to doing carnivore is I had soaked all these lentils and made this wonderful lentil soup because I was having an attempt to do kind of I was a yoga teacher at the time, like do this little
Yeah,
cleanse. So sick. I'm like, oh yeah,
yeah,
my body can't handle lentils, even if they're soaked, even if they're, doing
yeah,
all the things. Like I get so sick from eating lentils and beans. Like I just can't, my body can't do it. And then
yeah.
I went straight to carnivore. Uh, and all my digestive stuff went away, uh,
Yeah.
along with my
Yeah,
hormones. Right.
and the genetics of it, there's some people that can do it well, can handle
Mm-hmm.
it okay if they do things specifically, and there's some people we tell them don't even bother, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
there's an interesting one where we did some work with the US female Olympic team where a similar question to the Navy SEALs is like, why are some of these young women struggling with the same food, same training, whatever? So we went into it, and what we found was they were all in this sort of low carb, high protein type diet. And
Mm-hmm.
some of those young women were actually genetically wired to do really good on carbohydrates. They thrive
Mm.
on them. So
Okay.
there's an enzyme called amylase. So the amylase activity in them, excellent. Their insulin
Mm-hmm.
response, excellent. They are designed to be carb processors. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you take it away from them and then you put them into a fatty protein diet where they actually can't process the fats effectively, they feel horrible and they lose muscle mass and they lose strength. And so, and we found that especially in the later part of the menstrual cycle, it was much worse for them.
Oh yeah. Oh
And
yeah.
they would start to get injuries. And so it was a simple tweak, which is, sorry, these women are wired for carbs, and let's bring them back in. And that doesn't mean they're eating a bunch of pasta and sugar. It means that they're
Right.
eating good, clean,
Crap.
healthy carbs, right?
Right.
And they started to thrive. So one simple tweak. And I would say that when it comes to diet and nutrition, you can look at the macros. You can also look at the micros, certain
Mm-hmm.
vitamins
Oh yeah.
and, what dose do you need and how many times a day do you need it. We can actually determine some of those things like B12. Did your
Mm-hmm.
ancestors eat more beef so you can actually swallow your B12? Or did your ancestors eat more goat and lamb where you need to actually take the B12 under your tongue sublingually? We can predict that
Mm-hmm.
genetically. But another big one that people don't think about is the behaviors of diet nutrition. I think where people get challenged isn't the food itself, but the compliance, the ability to actually follow the rules and
Oh yeah.
not cheating on the diet and lying to
Mm-hmm.
yourself, which is commonly the
Mm-hmm.
case. And
Mm-hmm.
so compliance and structuring the meal in a way where you'll actually do it goes back
Yes.
to executive function. So there's some
Mm-hmm.
people that the genetics around how quickly they actually feel full are different. And so there's some people that very quickly know that their gut is actually full. Their brain gets a signal. Some people, there's about a 15-minute lag. And so they can't understand why they can't lose the weight. when they're overeating every single day. There's some people that genetically can't experience satiety in their palate, so they need the flavor profile. And this is
Mm,
actually a survival trait of our ancestors that when they had access to calories, that they would seek variety to make sure they got all the nutrients they could possibly get. So their mouth prefers a lot of variety of flavor,
okay.
texture, all the and so if you eat your steak and potatoes and you have this bad gene pathway in your mouth, you're still gonna snack. You're still gonna graze the pantry. You're
Craving.
still gonna say, where's the
I've
cookies, right?
seen that. I've seen people do that on carnivore and that they gain
Yes.
weight on carnivore because they're told just eat more meat. If you're still hungry, eat more meat. And then they gain 20, 30 pounds because they're like, well, I was still hungry. And I'm like, but you, it's something in the brain is just not working.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah,
it
and that
makes
can all be
perfect.
predicted genetically. And then the good news is there isn't any problem where there isn't also a solution. And
Mm,
that's great about the functional thing. It's not like here's your genes, good luck, right? You don't experience satiety, good luck. It's more like, okay, well, we
we need to
know
do this.
that fiber creates satiety. So
Hmm.
15 minutes before your meal, why don't you occupy some percentage of your gut with fiber? Have a
Interesting.
bunch of
Yeah.
some water with a scoop of fiber, and then start that satiety gene going 15 minutes before your meal. And all of a sudden, you're eating the right amount of food, right? If you don't
Yep.
experience satiety in your palate, well, hack it, create the satiety, eat the
Yep.
planned meal, but also have ready to go little piece of dark chocolate, little piece of nuts, cheese, fruit, flavor,
Hmm.
variety, texture, and all of a sudden you're giving your genes the signals they need to shut the hunger off.
Yep. Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, I could never lose weight on carnivore. I'm like now I'm 5'7". I didn't even know I weighed this much because I just did my insurance, life insurance, and they weighed me. I was like, oh, I've lost weight.
Yeah.
Like I'm down to like 133 now. I'm pretty tall. And I was shocked that I was down that low because when I was on carnivore, the lowest I could get was 160. And it was a struggle because it was just like you're just eating meat and you're just eating eggs. And it was like something in my body I couldn't my thyroids and my hormone were not happy. And then it was just like I'm still hungry. Like I couldn't really regulate it. And I was so strict for 2 years. And then it's like I go into more of a local seasonal approach with my diet and, have a little bit more variety of like what's growing around me, utilizing the markets. And yeah, this is the most effortless I've ever been able to maintain this weight in my life in my mid 40s when I'm supposed to be quote unquote getting
Yeah.
older, being, gaining the weight. And it's like, you know, I guess for me, and I haven't looked at the genetics, obviously, I'm probably somebody who's going to thrive a little bit more with a little more fiber, a little more variety than trying to
Yeah.
go, just straight carnivore. It's so multifaceted, I think.
Yeah. And so this is
Yeah.
the typical journey. Somebody's trying to heal, and there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of trial and error, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of one size fits all advice. And
Yep.
eventually you hit something that's like, wow, this is exactly what I needed, right?
Yep.
And so all we're saying is if you read the human instruction manual, you skip all that. You go
Right.
straight to exactly what you needed, right? Because the
Yeah.
genes don't lie and they don't change. So whatever
Yeah.
wiring you have that allows you to feel good now that didn't feel good before, uh, every 5-year-old child should know how they're wired so they just don't make a mistake.
Mhm.
And imagine if you
You
always
had that
did the right
information.
thing. Yeah, how
Yeah.
how long would you live? How good would you feel if every single
Right.
choice was the right choice?
Yeah. Rather than trying to fight and put every child in a box and put them in
Yeah,
front of an iPad and keep them in a school of fluorescent lights all day long and say, why does my child have, and feed them all these foods, which is a whole other topic. But why does my
yeah,
child have ADHD? Why does my child have depression? What's going on with my kid? And these kids are so unhealthy. And it's just, yeah, I have my toddler and I'm constantly like, okay, looking at the next phase of his life, how can I support him so that he's not kind of put in this box. And I remember you were
yeah,
talking about your children and how I feel like one of them you had to kind of change their diet because
yeah.
they were exhibiting hyperactivity symptoms or couldn't focus on their
I was
homework.
I was told by a teacher that this child had ADHD.
Mm,
And then I also noticed the ADHD symptoms at home. They wouldn't do their homework, tantrums, things of that nature. So when I looked at his DNA, I wasn't looking for ADHD. What I was looking for is what biology is broken
mm,
and how, in combination with with his habits, does that equal the way he feels? So unlike those female Olympians, he had the worst starch pathway. He had the
Oh.
worst insulin response, worst possible, right? So his ability to use carbs and starches as fuel is the worst you could possibly imagine. And
Mm.
no surprise, the teacher that was complaining that he had ADHD was right after lunchtime
Uh-uh.
when he was in a carb coma, right? And no surprise that the homework tantrums were right after dinner time. And he lived in a South Asian home where he was eating rice every single day, right?
Mm.
And probably a little bit too much. So now that I know how he's wired, even that one tweak, like there was a borderline medical diagnosis of ADHD in this
Yeah.
child, right?
Mm-hmm.
His
Mm-hmm.
extracurricular math class also said the same thing. His teachers were saying he needs to go to a doctor versus tweak in diet and tweak in timing of the diet. And all of a sudden
Mm.
he doesn't have a mental health issue anymore because it wasn't ever a mental, it was a metabolic issue. That's all it was.
Yes. 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 Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I feel like is going on with a lot of the children now is severe metabolic issues that are
Yes.
again multifaceted. The food, the lighting, what we're having them to do during the course of a day to fit into this box of
Yeah.
society. And yeah, I think we got to pay attention to it a little bit more instead of just putting people on medications. Because just going back to your origin story, people, and I think people are listening to this show, they know that the solution is not to go necessarily to the doctor to suppress these symptoms.
Yeah.
It's like, why were you getting psoriasis and eczema and having these gut issues? Like, why? Just a
Yep.
medication, and you're like, just a medication is not going to address like why is this happening?
Yep.
So yeah, we have to
Yeah.
look.
Medication for me became a dependency.
Yeah, exactly.
Literally.
And
It was a choice between eczema this week or not, and that's
mm,
medication or not. So, but I
wow.
don't have it now,
That's amazing. That's so good.
right?
Yeah, and that's a big problem with children these days too, is the eczema, which is a
Yeah.
whole other topic. And I've have kids, non-vaccinated kids now getting eczema. And so we always want to point the finger at one thing,
Yeah.
but it's so many that come into play in the environment. Yeah. Wow, it's been an hour and I wanted to I'm like, okay, I had so many other things. One other thing I wanted to talk about was just this high fat thing in regards to the diet, because there's a group that I know they're very well meaning. They're more of a low carb group, and they're putting all this information out that high fat diets, doing a high fat version of a ketogenic diet, high fat version of a carnivore diet is going to cause a blood sugar or an insulin issue. And I'm
Yeah.
like, do what? Like how is that possible? But what I caught you saying that earlier in the conversation that actually genetically could happen for certain people. Can we talk about that a little
Yeah. So
bit?
there's two things to look at. There's a gene called TCF7L2, which
Mm,
regulates insulin response and effectively whether you're insulin resistant or not. And a lot of people, again, it does not happen right away. And this is
hmm
why the diet doesn't get blamed.
Right.
But if you have bad genetics here, it will take about 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, and you're going to start to struggle. And then you're going to see spikes in insulin dysregulation, and it's going to come from the high fat, the ultra high fat diet. There's
Mm,
also certain ethnicities that have a phenomenon going on called epistasis. So what we've been talking about so far today is genetics, which is what version of what
hmm
gene do I have? Then
hmm
there's epigenetics, which is how do my habits affect my genes, which is how we
Yes.
determine what we should be doing. Then there's epistasis, which is one gene affects another gene.
Mm,
And in South Asian people, we find to an extreme that fat equals insulin resistance. And so it depends where the research is coming from.
that's what I was
A lot
looking
of
at their
research,
research. Yeah.
yeah, they have their own research. And yeah, and so that now all of a sudden crosses over and there's conflict, but the bioindividual, that's not been considered in the research. It's still one size fits all. So it's like we prove this, well, we prove this. Well, we're both right. So who's
Right.
actually right?
Right.
Well, then maybe both are true. Right.
Right.
So yeah, so I would say that. And then there's genetics around actually being able to use saturated fat as fuel. There's a
Mm,
gene pathway called ApoA2,
yes.
and some people are struggling there. And it's same as not being able to metabolize starch or greens or anything else. And you probably already know that you eat a steak and you feel heavy, you struggle.
Right.
There's a bit of a
Yeah.
lag, right? So if you have that combination, a bad ApoA2 and bad insulin resistance, you are going to get diabetes from a keto diet.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. And that, you know, because they were pulling out research papers and I'm like, but who's this done on? What is their genetic make? Like, you can't just pull studies and say this applies to the entire population.
exactly. Yeah.
So that that makes a lot more sense. And you know, again, still continuing to talk about keto diets and high fat diets, certain people will get really super high cholesterol on these diets, and certain people don't. And then certain people will actually go get a CAC score and their level is 0. And then some people it can be elevated and from following the same exact diet. And you know, barring the whole mandated medical procedures and how those are impacting people's heart issues. We don't even have to go into that. I know people who haven't gotten that mandated medical procedure and are still having these issues with calcification, higher CAC scores, things like that. And I know there has to be some sort of a genetic component here as well, correct?
Yeah, every step in every process, there's a gene that instructs what your body should do. So
Mm,
from the cholesterol receptor to the cholesterol production, there's some people that just don't do a good job of transport of lipids in their
mm,
body. And so,
mm,
and only 11% of our cholesterol score, let's say, comes from food. Most of it
mm.
is a response to inflammation. So your food
Okay.
shouldn't impact it so much. If it does, then you probably have bad genetics around the whole cholesterol cascade. And this is an indicator of Alzheimer's risk, dementia risk also, because it's much easier to develop plaque in your brain, but because of the cholesterol. But once again, we don't see it as a prescriptive risk. We just see it as what's the actual biology? Oh,
Mm,
your cholesterol receptors don't work so well. So they don't
mm,
know how to bind and move cholesterol. And so you're going to have higher levels in your blood. And that
mm,
doesn't mean you're high. Your baseline may just be high as a norm for you, right? And it may be that you made one tweak, went on a high fat diet, and that was enough to take you over the tipping point. But
mhm,
if there's no plaque, the concern isn't there. But if you start to develop plaque, then we have to jump in and mitigate. There's also genes around how effectively you actually utilize cholesterol. There's receptors that bring the cholesterol into the tissue and actually get it to the location where your body's trying to fight inflammation. That's what the cholesterol is for. And sometimes those receptors aren't working so well. And so the body keeps sending cholesterol, but it's not being utilized in the location that has inflammation. And so it shows up again high in the blood. But it's not
mm.
high because you're making too much, it's high because you're underutilizing. So different problem to solve. So any one of these questions, it sort of doesn't matter what we're talking about. There's always a way to reverse engineer what biology actually led to it. And if you deal with that root cause and you are bio-individual in your perspective, the problem is entirely avoidable.
Yeah. You know, I see people struggling with this and then they go to their doctor and they're given a statin. And it's like, well, that can cause a whole bunch of other issues. And we're
Yeah.
still not dealing with how did you get here? Why did you get here? If there was a way to get here, then how do we walk back? How do we unwind it? And I
Yeah.
think that's really the wavelength that I think my community is on. I'm definitely on. And the kind of conversations I want to have and information I want to put out there is like, all right, instead of just pushing this down, let's talk about how to walk back from it and actually be productive and understand that whole framework.
I agree. That's how we should handle our health and wellness. And then at that point, chronic disease is optional.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you know, as far as the whole hormone thing, just going back to that one more time, you know, I heard you say on another podcast that you do see that some women can benefit from uh, bringing a little bit of hormone replacement therapy in. But you do that and you kind of advise women from this lens, again, of this is how your body could possibly respond to these specific hormones, correct?
Correct. Yeah. It's not a question of yes or no. It's more about getting
Mhm.
it right.
Yeah.
Whether you
Yeah.
need a specific form or you need a lower dose or you need to add a certain nutrient to help you detoxify. It's what is my personal BHRT plan as opposed to here's your prescription.
Yeah.
So I
And
I guess the good news is that it's not a yes or no question. So if you feel you need them, there's a way to do it safely,
mhm. Yeah.
but there's also a way to hurt yourself. So this is the one area, whether man or woman, that I would say you don't do it unless you know your genetic source. Everything
That's
else is
how
just optimization. Sorry?
I said that's how I feel about it. It's like you kind of
Yeah.
playing with fire around
You're
this.
playing
Yeah.
with fire. Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, so it's the one area. Everything else is just optimization. This is like you don't do it unless you know.
And the going back to that blood test, that is something that I've been talking about with my partner Carrie. We have a podcast about how what you see on a blood test is not always what's going on in the body because it's
Yeah,
depends on that receptor sensitivity. So I
exactly.
want to like have that conversation a little more clarified, and would the same thing kind of be true of someone going out and spending $500 on plus on a Dutch test and looking at all these different pathways on a Dutch test? um, how useful is all that information for HRT if you don't have the genetic information to understand how the person's going to handle all of that?
You if you don't know why, then you don't know what the number means, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let me use vitamin D as an example. It's a simple,
Mm-hmm.
easy way to understand it. Um, we see vitamin D testing tell us that your vitamin D is super low, but then
Mm-hmm.
why do I not have seasonal mood disorder and I feel good, no issues? And then some people say your vitamin D is high, but then why do I feel horrible and I have all the symptoms of low vitamin D?
Mm-hmm.
There's three steps to vitamin D metabolism, which is step one, there's a gene called CYP2R1 that takes the D2 and converts it to D3.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's a gene called VDBP that takes that activated D3 you just made and transports it to the cell and moves it out of the blood towards the cell. Then there's a gene called VDR that makes a receptor that pulls it into the cell,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you have a bad receptor and a bad transport, your levels will be higher because you're once again underutilizing.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean you need more vitamin D because you
Right.
made enough. You need more frequent exposure to vitamin D so there's constant availability. Or
Okay.
the opposite, you may have really great receptor, really great transport, and then all of a sudden you'll be told the opposite, that your vitamin D level is low, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's like because
Mm-hmm.
you're great at utilizing, you actually didn't need to add any. And so
Right.
the question is, if you get blood work done and you see a red flag, you now have a question to ask your DNA. Why?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
the why will then tell you what to do
Yep.
with
I love
precision
that.
for you. And that's exactly how bioindividuality works.
Yeah. I love that because so many people are like, oh, you're low in this, just supplement.
Yeah.
This is low. Let's just add it back in. And then, like with the testosterone story with that client, it's like complete disaster. Her life has been
Yeah.
miserable for two months plus now because she thought, well, I'm low in this. I'm not really having any low testosterone symptoms necessarily, but I'm in my mid 40s. Let's just go ahead and try to add this in, and bam, disaster.
Yeah.
So I love this conversation about understanding like just because something is low doesn't necessarily mean let's add it back in. We need to understand why. Maybe this is the way that your body will express this. It doesn't necessarily need to be quote unquote at this level we've decided is the level everyone needs to be at, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Get it
Yeah.
personal, get it right for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have one more question. We haven't really talked about, and I don't know if you really look at this, the impact of haplotype or haplogroup on different genes, because that's something I do talk about in my group of like, if you're a northern haplotype, like I'm an H2, I do well with cold therapy. But if I have somebody who's a southern haplotype, they try to do cold therapy and their body is like, are you freaking kidding me? And same thing with keto. I do a little bit
Yeah.
better with, little short bursts of keto. Even a southern haplotype, not so much. And so I don't know if you look at that at all in the framework of what you do, or if you're like, it's not something we really study.
So the study of connecting the genes to it hasn't been done.
Mm,
But exactly what you're saying, we've seen genetically, which is some people do better with cold plunges, some people don't. Some people
mhm,
do good with red light, some people don't, right? And so why is it? So we can kind of explain the genetic profile that equals the outcome you're saying. And
mhm,
definitely you're going to find profiles that can be named as a haplotype that have those characteristics. So it'd be actually an interesting thing for you and me to do to sit down there and map it out together, right?
yeah, I would love
And that'd
that.
be a really cool thing, and then people can understand who they are.
Mhm,
But yeah, there's true eating for your blood type, all these profile things that you can do. We've seen them work, but the genetics hasn't been connected to them, but that's something that we should work on for sure.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'm an O negative, so I'm always like, I've been told I have vampire
Yeah.
heritage, all kinds of stuff. All I know is the blood bank is always blowing me up
Yeah.
to come back in and donate. I'm like, that's the only thing I found out about my blood is that everybody wants it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
Cool.
there's so much to look at when we look at human health and
Yeah, for sure.
bioindividuality. Yeah, yeah. Well, Kasi, thank you so much. This has been absolutely amazing. I can't wait to share this with my community. And like I said, well, you and I will talk a little bit offline about possibly offering something to my community in form of a master class that people can come attend and learn more. Maybe we can talk. You can tell a little bit of people
Yeah.
how to find you, and I know you do these master classes pretty regularly, right?
Yeah, connect with me on Instagram at Kashif Khan Official, but I would say wait for the masterclass that we're going to build together because we're going to dive deeper into the things that you actually care about because, Sarah knows why you're here, right? So we're going to custom build something that we haven't done before that's for you guys. So I think that's going to be an awesome, fun project.
Ooh, I'm excited. Awesome. Well, stay
Yeah.
tuned, and I'll be announcing something soon. And thanks again for being here. Again, this has been amazing, and I'll make sure all of your links are down in the show notes so people know where to find you and look at some of your work because it's a lot of really good stuff, and I appreciate everything you do.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for listening to the Evolving Wellness Podcast. Just a quick little reminder, this is not medical advice nor meant to be taken as a substitute for working one-on-one with a healthcare practitioner. And if you enjoy the show, please head on over to Apple or Spotify to leave the show up to a 5-star review. If you're over on YouTube, please leave us a like, leave us a comment. I really appreciate you for being here, for listening to the show, and your support means the world to me as I continue to try to pull guests from around the world to bring you informative content to empower you to make decisions about your own health. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.